Well, welcome to Scotland's Choice. Let's find out who's on the podcast today.
Hi, my name's Doherty. I'm a current sitting councillor in Glasgow Shettleston, and I am standing for re-election this year.
My name is Fergus Mutch. I'm the former head of communications and research for the SNP at Holyrood. I'm a two-time candidate in previous elections, unsuccessfully, I'm afraid to say, and I am in the fortunate position of not having to be a candidate in this election. I get to help other people this time round, and I'm delighted to be here on my first go of Scotland's Choice podcast, of which I've heard.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us, Fergus and Laura. Let's start off with a question to you, Fergus. You've obviously stood for election a few times, as you've just said, and now you're campaigning to help others to get elected. What initially got you into politics, and how did you become part of the independence movement?
It's a tough one. I think I'd always been politically aware. We had a sort of small P political family. There'd be interesting debates around the dinner table. My mum's side of the family, farming business background, they were maybe more of the Tory persuasion, whereby whereas my dad's side of the family a wee bit more in tune with my politics. So things could get lively at the dinner table. I think the moment I joined up to the SNP was when I was at university at Glasgow Uni studying law. You meet a lot of like-minded people who share your ideas, share your vision for the country. And I suppose at that time, I graduated just in the year that we secured the majority at Holyrood in 2011, went on to do a master's at UCL when I was down there. I heard the then First Minister at LSE giving his pitch on the economic vision for independence, what we could become, a more prosperous, fair, thrusting economy. And I thought, I believe in this. I really believe in this. I immediately started applying for a few jobs. I'd given up on the idea of being a lawyer by this stage. But it'll be much more fun to get involved with this work for the SNP, and I end up doing that. And that was me hooked and obsessed with Scottish politics ever since. So I think maybe always a latent belief that Scotland could stand on its own 2 feet, do things for ourselves, that was kind of crystallised when I was at university.
And Laura, what was it for you? What got you into?
Well, for me, I didn't have a particularly political family either, but there was always a kind of air of discontentment in the Union and Scotland's place in it and what we really got out of it. I actually went to university in England. It wasn't until I moved back from uni in 2012, just as the independence campaign was really kicking off, that I felt this is too big to not help out or get involved in any way. And then, like a lot of young people, when they joined the SNP, I got involved with the Young Scots for Independence, where on a campaigning trip in Lewis, I met the convener at the time, a young David Linden, who also happened to be my local branch organiser. And he got me involved with Shettleston branch. And as far as ending up, working in politics and running for election, I studied theatre and visual art at uni, so not politically minded at all.
Not the traditional route, no.
No, definitely not. And then back in 2013, less than a year after I joined the party, I get a call one night from that same David Linden to say a Labour councillor in my ward had suddenly passed away and that there was going to be a by-election, and would I consider putting myself forward as a candidate. I did, and although we didn't win that by-election, it definitely changed the path that I was on. And here I am, almost 9 years from that by-election, seeking re-election for that ward.
And clearly enjoying it since you're putting yourself up for it again. So, So before we get into the kind of core of our questioning today, how's your campaign going, Laura?
It's going really well. We're seeing lots of really positive results on the door. We were actually out the other week in an area of my ward called Cllr, which traditionally has been quite a Labour heavy part of the ward. They've always done really well there, and it's taken a long time to see a shift for us. But the results on the door they were quite spectacular. To be honest, we're going back out there tonight.
That sounds encouraging.
Fantastic. So,
and it's very different kind of territory up where you're campaigning for others, Fergus. What's the feeling where you are at the moment?
Yeah, I mean it's as diverse as it can possibly get in Aberdeenshire. You've got oil rich suburbs around Aberdeen. You've got very very rural remote communities such as one I live in Braemar, and Strathdon and Highland Aberdeenshire. You've got the fishing communities of Peterhead, Fraserburgh, and so yeah, quite a diverse kind of range. And I suppose a lot of them don't have somebody from Peterhead might not think that they've got an awful lot in common with somebody from the Mearns in Stonehaven. That has its own challenges, and I think the last couple of years have exposed some of those challenges around connectivity, how people work, how people receive their local services, whether it's health, education, or whatever. But we're not in power in Aberdeenshire. I think a lot of people have realised that the way that these have been delivered over the last couple of years has probably fallen short. So, real opportunity for our council group, which is in opposition, to kind of expose the failings of the Tory administration over the last couple of years. And yeah, I'm always a half glass full kind of person.
Good. And are you finding that, talking on that, in fact, I want to ask you both this, are you finding that people are more or less engaged with local elections than, say, the Scottish parliamentary elections or the Westminster elections? What's the level of engagement like?
I would say it's less, and I think that we see that in voter turnout as well. It's frustratingly so because, an awful lot of the issues that come up in the door are local issues, and I think sometimes that there's a disconnect between, what people believe that their local governments are for and what they're able to do. So when it comes to, even talking about really like huge global issues, like the war in Ukraine and, Afghan refugees being able to come to Scotland. Glasgow is a refugee dispersal city, but no one would think that that would be an issue to bring up with a local councillor or that local government would be dealing with, when it very much is.
Indeed. And what are the issues that folk in your community, what do they feel most concerned about, Laura?
I mean, right now, what's coming up in the doors for us is issues like the war in Ukraine, but also the rising cost of living is huge on the doors, especially fuel prices. That's coming up an awful lot. And then, being the local councillor on the door, we do get, the roads cleansing, but also pandemic recovery is a huge issue for people and things that they want to engage in.
And Fergus, we heard about the kind of energy costs there. You were saying you're in this place where there's a lot of traditional energy generation and production. And I've been taking a bill through Parliament, which is talking about those people who are living off gas grid, who are paying 4 times more in terms of for their heating than others. And you finding these are the same kind
Me. That's where life in Braemar, and actually huge swathes of Aberdeenshire. The gas line comes in from the North Sea at St Fergus, and then it goes through Aberdeenshire. But actually, places like the community I live in, they've never been connected to gas. So you get expensive oil delivered in bulk to the area, and you pay thousands of pounds for a tank load. And yeah, the cost of that has, as you say, multiplied several fold. And that's tough because actually these are the communities that were already struggling with fuel poverty before we faced the price rises that have come in just this week. That cost of living crisis is going to be acutely felt in so many communities across Scotland, but there's a real rural element to that too, which I'm sure you recognise from your own caseload as well, Drew. And I think there is that kind of obscenity really, that the northeast of Scotland has been the energy driving region for the entirety of the UK and in global terms as well. When we export our expertise and our skills and the things that we manufacture for the global energy industry, at the same time people here are paying through the nose, and it's as unaffordable to people in this region as anywhere.
And it's not just oil and gas. I mean, people can look out their windows and see the renewables generation that's going on, in Aberdeenshire and the rest of the north of Scotland as well, which is exporting this. And yet, as we've said in the previous podcast, we're paying more even just to connect those wind farms and everything else to the grid. We have to pay through the nose for that, and then people are charged a higher unit for their electricity if they live in the north of Scotland.
Yeah, and I mean it demonstrates the whole imbalance in the system, and it's a system designed to suit the needs of South England,
Mhm.
and that's the problem with withholding, part of the control over the industry, but not the infrastructure, not so much the jigsaw, and it just can't design a system that works, makes things affordable, and delivers the outcomes that we desperately need at a time like this. And the other problem is you can't respond quickly to a crisis like this when you don't control the levers.
And Laura, you were talking about, the cost of living crisis being, part of the concerns. Of course, people don't often realise, the council often have to, to an extent, pick up some of the pieces that have to fund different groups and help different groups to support people. And it's quite a big issue in terms of, and the decisions that are made in the council, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in our we just passed our council budget, our last budget of the term, and in that budget, we in Glasgow are having to invest, I think it's around £3 million to try and mitigate the cost of living for people in the city, and it's like Fergus was saying, you don't control the levers. We have not just a national government in Scotland, but local governments having to mitigate the decisions that are made by governments in London.
Well, you're just talking about that mitigation that your council's having to make, but of course that's on top of the things that we, we have to do in Scotland, such as mitigating the entirety of the bedroom tax, bringing in the Scottish Child Payment and a range of other benefits that we've had to bring in, even though we only have 15% of the benefits powers in Scotland. Bringing these in just to kind of mitigate the cuts that have been made elsewhere, and of course that crisis that's going on just now.
And from and I suppose from a commentator's point of view, an observer's point of view, yes, absolutely. And people conflate the two wrongly. We should be mitigating them. Yes, we should be, because that's the responsible and right thing to do. Absolutely. But that when you're working within a fixed envelope of a budget, and that money has to come from somewhere.
Indeed, and when you can't generate the funds in order to pay for these things, when you are working in that fixed budget, it means that you lose out elsewhere. And of course, councils quite rightly are held to account for the state of the roads and for other facilities and so forth as well. And all these choices that are made in terms of mitigations are taking money away from you. Let's move to the situation that we're in at the moment. Do you think as we navigate the pandemic, do you think the pandemic has changed people's views on local services?
I mean, I think it's changed the way that people want to be able to access their services. And Fergus touched on this a bit earlier. It has certainly had an impact on how fast we have moved to being far more digitally inclined with our services. And those people who want to use our services that way. But of course, with the speed that's came in, we need to be recognising that people aren't left behind. And certainly in my community and in areas in the East End, and I'm sure it'll apply across the country in rural locations as well, that digital exclusion's a huge problem, and the support that's needed to either improve digital literacy or even access to digital infrastructure will vary across communities. And that'll look different even in Glasgow. What works in Shettleston may well not work in somewhere like Castlemilk.
I think that that notion that we had to build back better, to borrow somebody else's phrase, but that idea of getting the recovery right was on people's lips from as early as April 2020, May 2020, just weeks into the pandemic. I suppose what's maybe disappointing, and this is probably fair criticism of government at every level, is matching that ambition with strategies that could be put into place at this stage when we're 2 years on, and actually we all want to get back to normality or whatever the new normal is. And why are those? Some are probably coming on the stream now, but actually there's not a lot of time to lose in ensuring that we make the best out of it. And something like addressing broadband speeds in rural locations. The costs involved in some of these solutions, in rural Aberdeenshire, where I am, you're talking about 15 homes, and they've been quoted £5 million to connect them to to something that governments are trying to make available to all. Now, that's prohibitive for them, but at the same time, we're also saying to these communities, you need to access your services online. Your kids need to go to school online. You need to access local healthcare solutions online to save you the round trip. And it's just actually sort of rural proofing some of these policy ambitions, which are all well and good. But another case in point would be 20 minutes neighborhoods that we're talking about for people to get their goods and services in the local area. That's fantastic. That'll reduce our carbon emissions. It'll breathe some vitality into local areas. But Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen City, people drive from Banff to do their shopping in Aberdeen. You can't just wish that away at the flick of a switch. That will take time to address habits, to build up infrastructure, to restore local high streets, to do all of these things. So it's the ambition is great, and these last 2 years have really got us thinking again about how we do all of this. But the delivery will be everything.
And of course, as we're talking here just now, I think people will be getting the reality that being a councillor isn't just potholes and planning committees. This is a very wide-ranging job. We've done other local election specials, and I spoke in one with Emma, Olaf and Lloyd on the challenges around getting people to stand for local election. And as we mentioned there, you probably know that there are 18 councillors that are already elected in Scotland without any contest. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on why so few people want to put themselves forward to stand as councillors.
I suppose it's a mix of things. Obviously, the pay is an issue. The pay for the workload and the hours that you have to do. It's treated in a pay scale as being a part-time job. It is not, it's not to do it well. And actually, we just had our last full council of the term, and we had a motion on specifically on why it is so difficult to get women to stand for council, and also to maintain women in council. The vast majority, I think, of the councillors that are standing down after only one term, certainly in my council, are women. There's a whole host of reasons as to why that's the case. The pay, the hours, also the need for us to also have an online presence, and all the issues that come with that is an issue. There's also, I suppose, limited resources that we have sometimes to do the job that parliamentarians certainly don't have. Parliamentarians will have a team around them to be able to do so much more, whereas we are just ourselves. You might have a support officer that will help with the sort of admin of your job, but other than that, it's you. You are your own caseworker. You're your policy assistant. You're everything for yourself, and that, coupled with the pay and all the flack that you can get,
That's right.
does put people off.
That's right. When I was elected as a councillor, fair enough, way back in 2007, you were given basically some business cards and a BlackBerry, as it was then, mobile phone, and that was it. There was no other kit or support.
Well, it's an iPhone now.
Anything like that. But and a lot of people, I've said this before. A lot of people just don't understand, the duties of a councillor, how much work goes into it. And, if you're doing it properly, we know that some people don't do it properly, but I think the vast majority of councillors either try to do it well or do it really, really well and don't really recognise the rewards for it. Have you got any thoughts on that, Fergus?
Yeah, much the same as Laura. I think just the base level salary isn't competitive, to be honest. I tried desperately to get some younger people in the local area to stand in the most recent election, and put it this way: a young apprentice in a business who's tapped in, is an active member of the community, knows everybody, participates in the community council, has been an S&P member for years, ticks absolutely every box. And when I mentioned it to him, he said, "Well, fine if I wanted to half my pay and deal with all the grief that comes with it." And he said, "You could be a retail supervisor and earn considerably more than you would in a councillor's role, and that comes with far less of the hassle than, as Laura says, putting yourself in front of people. They expect a lot of you, and we should expect a lot of our elected representatives. But it's simply just not an appealing prospect unless, in many cases, you're independently wealthy, or you're retired, or and somebody like Laura who's just committed, and it's the committed, passionate people you want to attract into local politics, but it's not necessarily them that respond to the call, and the problem there is, if you want good people, decent remuneration that reflects the job that they do is number one.
I think if you also want people who reflect the community that you live in, there's huge barriers for people from, LGBT backgrounds, from BME backgrounds, who would really struggle on the pay and the conditions to access. It is, like you say, I mean, for a long time, councils were, filled with predominantly wealthy white men who, were able to either take the pay cut or have a pension on the side that, they were able to do the job.
Which is why you find, that often the youngest members in a council are somewhere around between 40 to 50 years old, because other younger people have been able to get into that. Let's talk about about communities. Over the past few years, participatory budgeting has become more commonplace. I'm interested to hear both your thoughts on whether this is a model that you believe in and believe it works, and can we build on any successes or lessons that we've learned from our own communities?
I think it's hugely important, and definitely the way forward. I think it's certainly a way to re-engage and reinvigorate community councils, because they're often seen as talking shops which have little clout, but actually they have a real fundamental building block of our democracy role to play in saying, how is money spent? Why don't, for example, community councils have a role in saying how local schools are run? Other Scandinavian models of government, they certainly do, and that's no bad thing. Get the decisions being made closer to home, and I think once you get people involved in that, it's a really good thing, and it's not necessarily just public sector budgets either. So we were talking about renewable energy a moment ago. When you've got community wind turbines, community hydro schemes, like they've got in my local area, as soon as you get people coming up with the solutions themselves for how to build a better community, then the fact that there's a wind turbine on the hillside doesn't really bother them anymore, because everyone reaps the benefits. So, empowering people, giving them serious power over decent chunks of money. I'm not talking about 200 quid for for some new traffic cones for some safety scheme. I'm talking about real money to reinvigorate their local park to the tune of £100,000. That sort of money, and that can make a real difference to people getting outdoors, to young people leading active lifestyles, for the rest of their days. That's the stuff that really makes a difference.
So, I mean, in Glasgow, as part of the sort of Glasgow Community Planning Partnership, each of our wards, each 23 wards in our council, have what's called an area partnership. Now, that body, as well as having lots of other responsibilities, has a budget, and it's councillors sit on that, as well as members from community councils, members from public and voluntary sectors also sit on that, and they are able to basically dish out and allocate money to various groups and organisations that are in that ward that provide various services that people need. We funded groups like Ships and Growing Project, Fuse Youth Cafe, funded charities like Say Women as part of the area partnership. Now, this was only introduced last year, but we have allocated in Glasgow 1.5 million of our budget last year and again this year to what's called the Parks and Open Spaces Fund. And that is divided up amongst the area partnerships as well. So local members, as Fergus was saying, community council, members of the community can come along and say where they want things in their ward. What kind of, like for example, we agreed last year to look at widening some of the access points to various parks within the ward. I know other wards in the council have had money allocated to sort of semi-derelict spaces to create a place for people to be able to spend time and to improve the area. And that all works really, really well in Glasgow. On the community council front, I think that there's things that need to be improved within community councils as well, because community councils have a similar problem to, people seeking election, is that the demographic of community councils doesn't always reflect the communities that they are in. And it's how do you make community councils also accessible to, not just retired people or people who have the time, but also people from across the community and across the different demographics of that community to be able to see. Yeah,
that's a really good point, because you all know the communities thrive when democracy is closer to people. And at the moment, the Scottish Government's Democracy Matters Local Governance Review is looking at ways to strengthen both communities and local democracy. So I'm interested in your thoughts on how we can best move forward and to encourage and develop local governance to be much more inclusive of those kinds of community groups. What are your thoughts on that?
So also, I guess it is also looking at what's already there, like the community council network and how best we can utilise community councils. Also in Glasgow, we have the Open Government Action Plan that was approved a few CACs ago, that looked at things like participatory democracy, things like citizens panels. They were looking at exploring a open digital engagement platform, and it's looking at the different ways that people want to engage, and whether that is something like a citizens panel where there's an issue that people want to talk about and actually want to have a bit more of a say on, as far as policy making. You can have something like that. You could have something like a digital platform for people, and that being fed back to community councils or community councils and different organisations being able to play a role in them, as examples of things that we're working on or looking to explore working on.
Yeah, I think that those are both great. That's kind of what people really respond to, I think, Laura, and that kind of citizens panel, what used to be called town halls, I suppose. What's the problem we've got? We don't necessarily have the solution to it. Over to you guys. And there's no better way to stimulate a debate and actually get great ideas out of people, because more often than not, it won't be the council official or the councillor necessarily who've thought round the issue 20 times that knows exactly how it should be dealt with. It'll be the person who's living on the doorstep.
Yeah, that's a good point, because one of the great community projects that's happening in the Highlands at the moment is a project called Edible Growing. So that's basically community volunteer groups and working with ward councillors and council staff to identify areas where they can grow things like herbs and fruits and other food. It takes loads and loads of boxes. Yeah. Can you come up with any specific examples of the community working successfully with the council on your patch? Are there other things like that you can give us examples of?
Yeah, I mean,
brilliant. Sorry, on you go.
No, so I mean, I mentioned it just briefly, their Shelton Growing project, which is a very similar project to I guess what's going on, but fundamentally with Shelton Growing project, they're community allotment, but it's more than just about food growing. They have a young kids club called the Smelly Welly Club, and that runs, I think, from Easter to Halloween, and it's bringing kids from an area of the city where the vast majority of people live in flats and especially up tenements, into the natural environment, to explore not just food growing but biodiversity, the climate crisis, and also with some of the other guys that are using it as an allotment, definitely during the pandemic when a lot of people in Glasgow were confined to flats, and we didn't have an abundance of outdoor access. It was a project that really went some way to ease the sort of social isolation that an awful lot of people were having to deal with, and just to get people outdoors, seeing each other, and also with the young kids as well, that sort of intergenerational relationship that sometimes can be missing in a lot of communities.
You're talking there, Laura, about kind of what you can do to help people to kind of get out and reconnect and do all those things. And earlier on, we were talking about the cost of living crisis and the real challenges. I mean, challenge is too soft a word. The absolute crisis that, and it is a crisis that people are going to have to somehow navigate. And I'm interested, following on from what you were saying just now about, those things that, post-pandemic, that if it is post-pandemic that are happening. How do you think councils can best help constituents through these really difficult times?
I mean, I think it'll obviously be community dependent. Like I say, in Glasgow, we've had to, add a 3 million into our budget to help address these. Now, that'll help, with things like fuel poverty, help with one-parent families, and assist other people struggling with the cost of living. But ultimately, I think you need to be able to engage with your community to know how best people want to be helped. As I said earlier, what will work in Shettleston won't necessarily work in somewhere like Castlemilk or Cardonald, and it will, I imagine, be wildly different than what people will need in Banff. And it's having local councillors, and again, I mean, I might touch on this later, why these local elections are so important is that you need to have effective elected representation on the ground in your communities that are interested in not just leading, but helping communities to be able to lead themselves.
And Fergus, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the fuel poverty challenge is a huge one, and it's it's designing solutions that put communities first.
Laura was talking there about a community group that was also looking at the issues around climate change and so forth. Just to probably push this a wee bit further, what opportunities do you see within your local authority area to tackle the twin problems of both the energy crisis and meet the demands of climate change?
Yeah, well, there's a brilliant example actually in the Tarland Town of Cllr area of West Aberdeenshire. It's a very community minded group of local people who have done everything from community horticultural schemes, replanting trees, creating floodplains, floodland to control the more regular flooding that we're already seeing in these communities because of climate change. They're doing a fair share scheme, which is a kind of well, it's essentially food banks without the stigma that often comes with food banks, because you think Aberdeenshire, you think people are well off, but no, they have there's really acute challenges in certain communities, and all of this in tandem works. One, to create a stronger sense of community. Two, to address some of the real climate change challenges that people are seeing right on their doorsteps, to be honest. And three, yes, that problem with local poverty, whether it's driven by fuel, employment, whatever, having a ready-made kind of partnership locally. One of the things I would say that there's perhaps a role for local government in assisting with is access to land and access to property. There's plenty of land to go around in somewhere like Aberdeenshire to do community gardening schemes, to do grow your own allotments.
Release that land to more people so they can get more done. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. And there's plenty of our land in Aberdeenshire that is held by a small number of landowners. Some exercise the use of the land very well, very responsibly, but there are some other fairly notorious examples who do not. It's intensive sporting use and sporting use only, with little community benefit, little environmental benefit, and little commercial benefit too. To be quite fair, it's just land banking, and in huge swathes of the north of Scotland particularly, and the south of Scotland for that matter. Too much land is held by too few and serves a very little purpose.
Indeed. We spoke earlier about the fact that the Scottish Government has to use its budget, as the councils, to mitigate the impacts of draconian Westminster policies that we see coming through. Why do you believe that this would change with independence, Laura?
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally it would change because the government that is implementing these policies isn't one with Scotland's interests at its heart. It's not one that we even voted for. And I think naturally with independence, the Scottish electorate, I mean, I suppose as they do now with the Scottish government, get the government that they choose, that has their interest and the policies that they wanted to see is where they will go to the ballot. Right now, that's not an option when we're in this union.
And Ferguson, what are your thoughts on that?
I think probably 3 quick points on that. With independence, we have greater accountability, closer accountability to the governments we elect. There's also whether it's SNP or otherwise, there's more likelihood of returning a left-wing government, which the punitive, cruel policies that we've seen from Westminster over the last decade plus, wouldn't be tolerable in that environment. I don't suggest.
Well, Scotland hasn't voted for the Tories since the 1950s. So, yeah.
Well, maybe to play devil's advocate on one point, what's imperative on us is to ensure that we're setting out that vision, and also to make sure that the economic fundamentals of that prospectus that we put to people is strong enough that we can afford all of these things. And we should be able to, by diversifying our economy, but don't take that as a given. That is a bit of the jigsaw that we need to work upon.
Okay, well, we've had a great chat. We're coming towards the end of our conversation just now. This episode launches just a short while before the election. What is your pitch on why it is important for people to vote in this election?
I mean, I mentioned this earlier, but so your local government is at the very core of the services that impact your daily lives. And that's from schools to regeneration, cleansing roads, but also we are impacted and we have to make decisions on, global, events and situations. Again, I mentioned that Glasgow being a dispersal city for refugees. It is so important for people to have the elected representatives that reflect their wants and aspirations, not just from themselves and their families, but for their wider communities as well.
I think all the SNP candidates that I know that are standing in this election are real champions of their own communities. And for them, this is a crucial election about delivery of quality local services and how we get that crucial recovery from the pandemic right to allow our communities to prosper.
Okay, well, a few quick fire questions to end off for us. If you could implement one policy or change a current policy the way we can't do at the moment under Westminster through an independent Scotland, what would it be?
I mean, immigration is the big one. I mean, I've also worked for parliamentarians and having to Westminster parliamentarians, and your dealings with the Home Office are just shocking. Like it is. I mean, it's not an understatement to say that it's just cruel. The current policies that are in place are just cruel, and we've seen it over the last year, especially with Afghan refugees and now with the war in Ukraine. There is no compassion or humanity in that department or with the current policies, and that's something that I think the vast majority of people in Scotland would love to see change. We would love to be able to, waive the visas ourselves for Ukrainian refugees. So that would be, sort of the top area that I would love to see change. Yeah.
And for you, Fergus?
Let's get the economics right, grow our economy, and do that in a way that shares the wealth around, leaves nobody behind.
Okay, many independent supporters want to help campaign, but they might be worried that they won't be able to answer questions about independence on the doors when they're out there. What advice would you give to them?
Don't worry. So what we do, certainly when we go out campaigning, if you're new, you're always paired up with an experienced activist, and you can stay paired up for as many campaign sessions as you like. I wouldn't say that we get an abundance of really tricky, difficult to answer questions, but you'll definitely be paired up with someone, and if not, just ask, and I'm sure your local organiser will get that sorted for you, and we'll show you the ropes, and you'll have a great time.
You've been out in the doors a few times, Fergus. What's your thoughts?
I think tell your own story. People can hear from Nicola Sturgeon, they can hear from Drew Hendry, they can hear from all the bigwigs in the party if they turn on the TV and they hear what they got to say.
Tell your own story. To look me in with.
There's nothing more compelling than that face-to-face conversation about each individual person's journey to yes. You don't have to have all the answers. That's what the politicians are there for. If you're a foot soldier, tell your own story.
And so, Fergus and then Laura, what's your pitch to folk who are still undecided on Scottish independence?
It makes sense to take decisions for yourselves. Don't let other people decide for you.
I think, right now it's as if we're living in a tale of two nations, and the disparity of the wants, needs and aspirations only has seemed to grown as the months and years have rolled on since 2014, and certainly before. And when the opportunity comes again to make that change, grab it.
I think that's a great place for us to end this episode of Scotland's Choice. Can I thank both Laura and Fergus for joining us today on the Scotland Choice podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Stu. Pleasure.